Hello again, folks. It's Hooves of Doom with another Topic of the Week video. This is a response to Vince Venturella. And as always, I will post Vince's video down below. If you go check out that video, you'll see plenty of other great responses. So, the topic of the week is scenarios in war games, and specifically, I guess, Age of Sigmar. And Vince is really asking three questions. How much should scenarios matter? How much do they matter to me? And do you prefer scenarios over simply stomping your opponent's army, or vice versa? Do you prefer to be more combat based over scenarios? I would say that scenarios do matter. That I increasingly really like them. And, every game does involve some sort of combat, but I would actually, the games that I played with the scenarios have certainly been more enjoyable than those that are just straight up trying to defeat my opponent's army. But all that said, I never really used scenarios in previous editions of Fantasy. There only were about half a dozen in the big red rule book for 8th edition. About 2 or 3 of those I always found were very limited. And so I think we only played scenarios like a couple times, and the vast majority of the games were pitched battles. So the scenarios are in some sense new, and they're certainly much different than what we have previously played in previous Warhammer games. So I would say that my love of scenarios is really only just developing. I've always liked the idea when people have talked about them, or if you come up with an interesting story, that's really cool. It just never really seemed to pan out in most of the games I played. So I've really only started fairly recently to play them with Age of Sigmar. I mean, most of my games initially were just regular pitched battles. And I think looking back on that, that was some of a mistake from previous Warhammer. And the more I use scenarios, the more I absolutely love them. So I think that's a common mistake for those that are trying out Age of Sigmar for the first time, is that they go into it with the older mindset. They have 2 conventional armies, and they smash into each other. And there are a lot of tactics, but you're not going to see them, in the first few games. It takes a while to really develop and recognize that this is a different game, that it operates differently. I think when people that don't play the game watch it on a video, it just looks like a jumbled mess. That's not really what's going on. And frankly, I think you could make the exact same accusation to people that don't play other Warhammer games or other war games. If you don't know the rules and you don't know the mechanics, it always kind of looks a little bit chaotic. So for anyone that's trying out Age of Sigmar for the first time, maybe 1 or 2 games where you use the older matched combat scenario just to kind of get the basic rules down, but begin to use those scenarios very quickly, if not from the very beginning, because Age of Sigmar needs them. It plays so much differently, and frankly, Age of Sigmar is new and different for many of us. But when you look back at the history of Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, in terms of its playstyle, really goes back to the earliest Warhammer roots, where the games were highly narratively driven. The earliest editions actually had GMs, and a rogue, a trader for 40k doesn't have a system of points. So in many respects, this is an attempt to recapture what made Warhammer work when it was, in its early infancy. And so the more freedom that we have as gamers, I think, is a good thing. And you can even make your own missions and your own scenarios. There's nothing wrong with that in Age of Sigmar. In fact, a lot of people are doing that. I think that's really awesome. More of that. But there are already so many scenarios in Age of Sigmar. So if you look back, at the Age of Sigmar book and the Quest for Galmaraz, there's 8 scenarios in each of those. I assume that's about the same for Balance of Power. I don't own that book, but I know that there are a number of scenarios in there. Each of the army books that have come out, they have at least 2 scenarios apiece. There are more scenarios available online through direct order, through I think the app. So you have already many scenarios, and more are being released every time a new book comes out. So it's great. There's, in some sense, obviously they took a degree of development in creating the scrolls and creating the basic rules. But I think the rules are being written in the scenarios. I think that's where most of the creative effort of Games Workshop is being put, to come up with many different missions that you can constantly play, to have a completely new play style every time you go and play. And that creates a degree of momentum, because it keeps the game new, and every time you sit down, it's a completely different experience, which is awesome. I suppose if you played a lot, you'd be able to play through each of these and get to know them. But again, if they keep releasing them, it's always going to have an element of being new, and the playstyle won't be the exact same. Speaking for myself, I don't play as often as I'd like, so there's no real reason not to play a different scenario each time I do play. And I've actually made a rudimentary chart for scenarios that we roll on every time we decide to have a game. So just to recap, I don't think there's anything wrong with playing the game as stipulated in the basic rules. For instance, if you don't have the hardcover books, that might be your only option. But the flavor and the story of the game is really contained in the mission and in the narrative that those scenarios create. So there are many different reasons why you should be using the scenarios. A lot of people look at Age of Sigmar and their biggest complaint is that there's no method to inherently, quote unquote, keep the armies balanced. But many of the scenarios don't require balance to be competitive. In fact, many of the objectives can be met even if you're quite heavily outmatched by your enemy army. There are a number of objectives that if you take the right units, you can win with a virtually very small model count. So it's not that traditional gameplay that we're used to. The scenarios are so broad, and there's so many, with so many different victory conditions, that it's really difficult to match them all perfectly. So, and those many victory conditions really emphasize army diversity. So you can't just come up with a single army design that just works every single time, because some of those scenarios really favor movement, others favor ranged attacks, others favor larger armies with many models, and some favor smaller armies with very few models. So it just really adds to the new play experience every single time that you want to have a game of Age of Sigmar. And I would point out that it seems to be the case that you should be selecting scenarios first, and then coming up with an army design. That seems to be the case when you look in the books, because the first thing that comes up with a scenario is that the armies need to be designed, or the models need to be chosen. So to me, that means that when you're sitting down to play, come up with a scenario, then design the army around it, because you want to maximize the types of units that are going to work best in that scenario. Of course, that's not always feasible for a lot of people, especially if you're playing a pickup game. But I just think that that's an interesting element. The basic rules seem to encourage a lot of linked games that really add to this type of dynamic. For instance, triumphs are something that I personally have overlooked thus far. And I haven't really even used realm-specific rules. But if you add all these elements together, you have a very rich game that is new and fresh every time you play it. And I think that the more scenarios I play, as I've said, the more I really, really love this game. So those are my thoughts on scenarios. And I appreciate you guys tuning in, and have a good one.